Let me touch on this board candidate packaging. And this is a way very early on to understand if the candidate, aspiring or experienced, has done the research to understand how do you properly submit for a board role. And I'll start off this discussion with a recent example. 2 weeks ago, at any given moment, I'm working with a nominating committee and a nominating governance committee. And in many cases, I'm helping them build out their process for vetting and appointment of directors on their boards. In fact, the trending in recent 5 or 6 years has been that many boards have pulled the end-to-end process, including the search, the vetting, and the appointment and the onboarding processes back fully into the nominating committee for multiple reasons. In some cases, they don't want to pay the finder's fee or the placement fee, which can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And boards now are also expecting more from their nominating committees. So they're looking for these roles and these obligations to be pulled back into these committees. So let me start with saying, how do you set yourself apart regardless of who is overseeing this process? And I'm going to start by saying that you should never submit a bio, what we call a regular bio, a resume, or CV. I'm going to explain why in a moment we don't do those things. And it's a very easy way for us to understand if a candidate truly has done their homework. Where I was going a moment ago was this recent client of about 710 submissions for a single open board role that they were looking for. Only 12 people submitted properly as we view proper board directorship submissions. What you should be submitting are called board documents. They are very different than a regular bio. They're very different than a regular resume and very different than a regular CV. Keep in mind that resumes, as an example, were designed for employee level positions, maybe even management level positions, where you list your title, the expertise, the things you accomplished. That's not how you make a great impression as it relates to a board candidacy. CVs also, in many cases, we see things that are submitted. They're calling them their board CVs. They're very more closely aligned, as far as I'm concerned, to an academic CV. It's still not pulling out the areas that we would view as important as part of proper board documents. So what does this mean? So first off, know that a job resume or CV, it guides you down the path of sounding more like management and less like leadership or governance material. So you want to put the efforts into creating these documents that we call board documents. Now, the high level of this, when we say board documents with the S, that includes two areas, what we call your board bio, which is very different than a professional bio, and your board document. I'm going to get into both of these. Note that the board document, along with the board bio, sits within your board documents. We like to say also you should have a proper board director cover letter for any role that you're submitting for. Now, what does this mean? So I'm going to use this silly hand gesture but I still think it works quite well to describe what I want to get across here. When we look at a traditional professional bio, it looks like an hourglass. It goes from a very wide viewpoint, summary, then it drills down, then it goes wide again, even includes maybe education or college that you had decades ago. The difference with a board bio is that we are looking at a funneling effect in a proper board bio. Now, a board bio should start out with, of course, these broad brushstrokes, what you're known for, the themes of your career, and of course, mentioning your accomplishments and maybe some of the titles you've been involved with that are board related or senior leadership related. But as you get further down into the bottom section of a board bio, there's really two main areas that you're driving this towards. You heard me use the terminology a moment ago of the workhorses of the board, which are the committee areas. What you want to show is how your experience, your expertise, and maybe what we call your proof, your education and your certification areas are supportive of the committees that you're claiming you will be or are a great member of, that you can serve on this particular board as a candidate. So you're driving this knowledge down into an area in this funneling effect that shows where all this great expertise and experience you have, how that's going to fit and make a difference on the board that you're applying for to get the seat or get the appointment. The difference in all of this, again, is that you need to show the evaluator, such as me, where you're driving your expertise and experience to and where you can serve, not just as a one-trick pony on one committee area or bring one expertise area, such as finance, to the board, but what other areas are you able to serve on? How are you a utility player, which most boards are expecting today? Now, those that only submit board bios are still missing half of the game when they submit. A board bio by itself, if I'm interested to learn more, will be followed up by an email from me to that candidate that says, I received your board bio, but I don't have your board document. Can you please submit your board document? And 90% of the time we get a response back saying all I have is a board bio. We don't really know what the board document is. Can I send you a resume? Don't be the person that does this. The difference in a board document is, yes, you can take certain information from a resume or a CV, but you again are going into this funneling effect. If I have to review a submission from you that's a resume or CV and carve out for myself the areas that are pertinent to senior leadership areas such as the C-level or the board of directors, you've already missed the exercise. You're supposed to carve those areas out for me or for an evaluator to understand what relevant background and experience do you have that makes you a great candidate for this board. So we typically start with a board profile that in many cases can be a repetition of the first paragraph of your board bio, but this is where it gets different. The next area or heading area should be your board and board committee experience. This can include board advisory positions, it can include board director positions, and you should definitely carve out the committees that you've served on. But know in this format that it's not forcing an evaluator to read through your how many pages of a document to get to what I view as board readiness. You want to carve that out. You want to also carve out what's called board level experience. This is where you are not a seated voting fiduciary board member, but you did something that made its way up to the boardroom. You presented an expertise area for the board to make a decision. You helped create a report for the CEO of the organization that the CEO was going to present to the board. These are areas that we call board level experience that shows you understand both sides of the table. And of course, any executive experience and areas that include your education, certifications, membership. The big differentiator here also that I want to point out for a proper board document is that unlike a resume or CV, a board document has a specific area for you to call out your core leadership traits, which then lead to what type of demeanor you have or your leadership style. This is very important, and we're going to get to this in a moment when we talk about focus areas such as values, to show that you understand the direct relationship between values of the organization to the risk of the organization. I'll get to more of that in just a moment. One last thing to say on this, there's a lot to talk about in the structure and what information to include in your board documents. Know that in the IBDC course, we actually go through all this and provide you with templates. There's other areas where you can leverage other services to build these correctly. Most of those that join the program and build their board documents out there, leveraging pre-existing resumes and CVs to help create their board documents. It's very worthwhile doing. The ability or the percentage of interviews, especially that come from properly submitted board documents, is very large. Know that also I am known for saying today, and I believe this to be true, it is harder to get to the interview for a board role than it is to get the appointment. Again, you could have 700 or 1,000 different submissions from day one for a single open board role. You need to set yourself apart before you're able to in person represent yourself. You do that through proper board documents.